Hello, I'm Dr. Daniel Fiott. I'm an assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, so the VUB in Brussels, and I'm also the head of the Defence and Statecraft Programme at the Centre for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy. And today, I hope to be able to give you a better idea, firstly, about the importance of critical technologies, but also as well a better understanding of what the EU is doing in this policy field in terms of securing supply chains and also making sure that we in the European Union have the critical technologies needed to keep up with our industrial processes and to keep Europe on the cutting edge of technology. So what are critical technologies? Well, I think in a word, there are two ways of thinking about critical technologies. On the one hand, there are technologies themselves which are used in critical ways. So you could, for example, look at how certain technologies are used in the medical field. Sometimes they're very sophisticated tools. Also, for example, in the defense sector, we use some very, I would say, specific and sophisticated technologies. They're not widely used or widely owned, hence the term critical. A second way of thinking about critical technologies are all of the component elements and parts and technologies that go into creating and developing a particular piece of technology. A lot of us are probably aware of the term supply chains. And in that term of supply chains, we do include the raw materials that you need to extract from the ground to produce certain technologies, but also the production of certain components that lead in to the development of an overall technology. Now, for the EU, I would say we have a multi-layered way of understanding what is a critical technology and how a certain technology qualifies as being critical. Let me say from the very beginning that through the European Council, there has been a lot of attention. So that is at the heads of state and government level, a lot of attention paid to the need for Europe to develop critical technologies by itself and to have access to the components that allow Europe to develop these technologies. With the European Council, we have the European Commission, who also plays a leading role in understanding what should be these critical technology areas. So far, there has been an agreement between the member states and the European Commission to identify at least 6 key enabling technologies. Those 6 technologies give us a better idea of what we mean by critical technologies at the EU level. Those 6 areas include advanced manufacturing, so that could be something like 3D printing, for example, nanomaterials, which relate to, for example, sophisticated metals or sophisticated materials like graphene, for example. We also have an area dedicated to life science technology. So that is about medical science, life sciences, biology, also enhancing. We then have another area focused on micro or nano electronics and photonics, which are really important for the production of sophisticated technologies. Fifth, we have artificial intelligence, which everyone is talking about today. And then finally, we have what the European Union refers to as security and connectivity challenges, or connectivity and security technologies, which refers to, for example, next generation communication, right? So 5G, 6G, et cetera. Also space-based communications too. So that in a nutshell, I would say are the 6 key areas. And then we could probably take a step back, also think about some of the elements that go into developing those key enabling technologies. So just as one small example, the EU also focuses on trying to maintain secure supplies of critical raw materials. So the types of rare metals, rare minerals that are needed to produce these technologies. And just as one example, the EU maintains its own what it calls critical raw materials list. The first time that list was put together was in 2011. And it included 14 critical raw materials. It was updated in 2020, so 9 years later, and it then included 30 critical raw materials. So an exponential increase in the number of raw materials that the EU considers to be of a critical nature. So I think there is an obvious case for the European Union to try and safeguard critical technologies. And in one respect, that really relates to the development of skills. So people having the ability to use these critical technologies, but also having investments in these critical technologies too. So having the finances to invest industries that develop critical technologies. But on the other hand, we also have to try and keep in mind that a lot of these critical technologies also relate to security and security concerns. So when we think about supply chain security, for example, a lot of the questions which we are now thinking about in the EU is, firstly, do we have enough domestic industrial capacity to produce these critical technologies? And secondly, where do we get these critical technologies when we want to integrate them into our own economy and industrial processes? And there, of course, the discussion turns slightly to some of the technology dependencies that Europe has on countries such as China, for example, and as well, most recently, although it's been significantly reduced, also some of the dependencies we may have had on Russia as well. So the issue of security, critical technologies, and dependency has become a real important issue for the European Union. Now, what has the EU done in response to that? Well, probably it's no surprise to learn that one of the most immediate initiatives by the EU is legislation, and the mixture in particular of legislation and financing. So if we look, for example, at legal instruments such as the FDI screening mechanism, so the foreign direct investment mechanism, the EU has already taken some steps to try and ensure that we have a standardized or harmonized process for understanding, for analyzing investments that are made in the European economy in critical technology areas. There are now also steps, by the way, at the EU to also look at external investments from the EU elsewhere around the world, and to also make sure that we don't develop dependencies in the future to other parts of the world too. And in particular, there is a fear that there is a potential for certain technologies to leave the EU market and perhaps be integrated into the military programs of third countries such as China or Russia. So screening FDI is really important, but the EU has also taken other steps. For example, if we look at the rather important discussion about increasing semiconductor production and design and fabrication in the EU has just this year actually agreed to the so-called CHIPS Act, or the European CHIPS Act, where the EU will use legislation and it will also use investments to try and enhance the amount of semiconductor production within the EU market. Today, the production levels from the EU are about 10% of the overall global market. The ambition is to reach at least 20% in the next few years. So there's a concrete step, I would say, for a very critical technology. And we know semiconductors are extremely important for all sorts of things: household appliances, electrics in cars, for example, and even for the defense sector and space sector. Absolutely critical, I would say. There are other steps that the EU has taken, I would say, which we can also class as mainly legislative. For example, we have seen now the proposal this year for a Critical Raw Materials Act as well. So that is based on the data that we already have about dependencies and shortages, that the EU now wants to legislate that the EU take steps, for example, in areas such as stockpiling, recycling, and also developing or increasing trade partnerships with third countries, in particular, I would say friendly third countries, where we can then develop or, let's say, profit from raw material partnerships through trade. There are other areas as well, which I don't think I have time to dwell on, but I will nevertheless underline them. And that is some specific initiatives in the area of space defense, and in particular the crossover, so the dual use synergies, if you want to call it that, between defense and the civilian sector. So the EU has, as of last year, firstly created what they call a hub for EU defense innovation, and they've also created an observatory for critical technologies. And both of those things, even though they are a kind of bureaucratic or institutional, let's say, development, really puts within the institutions the necessity and burden of identifying critical technologies for defense and key civilian sectors, and then to make sure that political leaders are fully aware of where dependencies might lie and where the EU needs to address it through investment, skills development, industrial capacity, etc. On top of that, finally, the EU has also tried to develop what they call technology roadmaps. So if you look in the specific area of the defense sector, and if you look at the crossover between civilian research in the Horizon program and also the space program, what the EU has tried to do is develop technology roadmaps for governments and for industry to have a much better idea of what technologies they might need, what industrial processes, what critical raw materials they may need as they move forward to the development of critical technologies in civil, space, and defense. So it's very clear that the EU has not only invested in policy responses to address critical technologies, but it also leads us to ask a more central question, which is, why does the EU need to protect critical technologies in the first place? And that invites us to think about the rationale behind the EU's own steps. Now, I've already mentioned in some of my responses the importance of dependencies, or making sure that those dependencies are not harmful to the European economy and to European security. And I think we've seen over the last few years a number of instances where dependencies have become indeed, let's say, critical and also have given rise to potential security risks. So, for example, I think the most readily available case that we have is the initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where immediately the global question became, who has the manufacturing capacity to develop, for example, face masks? Who has the capacity to develop oxygen machines? These were critical technologies right at the beginning of the pandemic. And then following that initial phase, the attention turned more to the development of vaccines and who had the ability to produce those vaccines and also order them en masse too. So I think the pandemic itself has raised serious questions about whether or not the Europeans themselves were able to produce those critical technologies for the benefit of their citizens in time. At the beginning, it is no secret that the EU struggled somewhat, not least in terms of making sure that supply chains were being correctly managed so that Europeans had the resources to develop these technologies. Also, eventually, with the vaccine rollout, you could see very clearly that the EU then stepped up its game in terms of being able to secure the right types of ingredients for the vaccine and also the supply and rollout of those vaccines too. But it's not just the pandemic. We've also had in recent years reason to be concerned, for example, about critical technology areas such as communications. And if, for example, you look at the very heated and important discussions related to 5G rollout, where there the real discussion became, well, yes, investing or let's say rolling out critical infrastructure that ultimately may be controlled by the Chinese state, not only raised questions about dependencies in terms of technologies on China, but it also gave rise to some very, I would say, important European concerns related to data protection, privacy, espionage, etc. So I think if you combine the pandemic and 5G in particular, you have two cases there where it became absolutely critical to think in the context of the EU about safeguarding critical technologies. Since that time, by the way, or since those two cases, we've also seen in the United States, I would say, a return, or let's say an emphasis towards more protectionist measures to protect and safeguard US security and the US economy. Now, even though most of the EU's own critical technology policies are not directed towards the US, I would argue they're principally geared towards the Chinese and also to some degree to the Russians and other, I would say, countries that could be considered hostile or rivals. Nevertheless, in the US context, decisions taken in Washington have let's say, an automatic knock-on effect for Europeans. So hence, when we think about maintaining a certain level of manufacturing capacity in Europe, maintaining a certain level of excellence when it comes to critical technologies, that is in an indirect way also to make sure that Europe is somewhat shielded from any of the, let's say, unnecessary or let's say even knock-on effects that may come from US policy that in itself is not even designed for Europe. It's designed for China as well. So in the context of US-China rivalry, but nevertheless has this knock-on effect for Europeans. So I think that therein lies the main dynamic also. And one final point on this, even though we might not consider ammunition as being a critical technology, it still also feeds into some of the discussions we're having a bit more broadly about what capacity the European Union member states themselves have to produce in a quick enough time technologies or resources that could be considered critical for security. And in this case, security for the Ukrainians and also security for European states themselves as they continue to try to defend themselves. So I would say that this logic of safeguarding critical technologies, of boosting manufacturing, has become so hardwired now in the EU's way of thinking about the world, its place in the world, and it also takes the idea of European security to a different level. So a few years ago, we would have considered security just to refer to crisis management and defense. Today, we have to have, and we are having, a rather in-depth conversation about economic security, for example, or protection of supply chains or critical raw materials. So the logic has entirely changed, I would say, over the last few years. The kind of rationale behind why the EU is investing so much more political energy into safeguarding critical technologies. And we've raised the question of the rise of China and also some of the indirect knock-on effects from the US. But we also have to then think, I think, more broadly about some of the consequences of this growing rivalry in the area of technology. And I guess one of the trends that people are investing a lot more, let's say, energy into analyzing is not only the growing relationship between trade, technology, and security, but also the much larger implication that all of this has for the global economy. And so for many years, we've been thinking about the global economy in largely free trade terms, I would say, with the underlying logic that through trade, through growing interdependence, it might be possible for states to change or develop in certain ways, to become more open, more free, and a bit more liberal. I think that consensus has been drastically challenged in the last few years. So much so that I think today there is much less emphasis placed on the idea of globalization more generally by some of its, I would say, historical supporters, such as Europe and such as the United States. So today we hear a lot more about the idea of deglobalization. We also hear a lot more about the idea of slowbalization, so not a complete end to trade, but let's say a modification of the functioning of global trade. And there are also questions within that context of deglobalization about whether or not the, let's say, free trading system, as we've known it, has to adapt and evolve into, let's say, much more of a closed or much more regional-based free trading arrangement. And in this context, we do hear a lot today also about the ideas or concepts of de-risking, reshoring, friendshoring, all of these types of new concepts, which essentially really, when you boil it down to its meaning, essentially means that, let's say, continents like Europe, countries like the United States, want to maintain free trade, but they want to do so with countries that they feel are part of a protected, consistent, and also safe global economy. To cut a very long story short, I guess you would say that, you know, countries such as Russia, China in particular, are increasingly using trade as a form of instrumentalization. Some call it weaponization. So to use trade, critical technologies, supplies as a political tool. Well, that leads some in Europe and also the United States to think about, well, where is it possible in the global economy to develop these types of relationships with countries where it's much safer to do so. Now, this takes, I would say, two forms, right? So on the one hand, we've been discussing about what Europe in particular can do more in its domestic market to increase its ability to develop critical technologies and secure raw materials. But there is also an invitation to think about what new trade partnerships the EU may want to strike up with different parts of the world. Now, in some cases, that has been almost a natural progression. And by this, I mean that if you look, for example, at the EU's trade agreements or economic partnership agreements, as they call them now, with countries like Canada and Japan, there you have very clear cases of where close partners, in many cases allies when it comes to Canada through NATO, try to put in place secure supply chains. In other countries around the world, which are considered friendly, part of the global trading system, but where there is no kind of formal alliance agreement between the US, Europe, and these countries, really there's an invitation to think a bit more about how policies related to development policy in particular, but also about, let's say, development or investments in global infrastructure could also incorporate these questions of, let's say, friendshoring or the development of new trade partnerships. So when you look at the United States and when you look at Europe, when they develop initiatives such as the Global Gateway Initiative for the EU or Build Back Better in the case of the US, there the idea is that we can develop global infrastructure and also at the same time develop a much more coherent development policy, which on the one hand helps in terms of the development of partners around the world, but also then integrates within that concept the idea of more secure supply chains, much more resilient supply chains too. Now, for the European Union and also for close partners such as the US, it becomes ever clearer that places such as Africa, places such as Latin America are resource-rich continents, but they're also continents where we share quite a, I would say, a closer partnership when it comes to development, economic relations, and political relations too. Now, that adds another layer of complexity because it means that the EU has to evolve how it thinks about development policy. But it also means that countries like China and also Russia to some extent also have an interest in, let's say, currying favor or maintaining stronger economic relations with countries in places like Africa and Latin America. So we're seeing, I would say, quite an evolution in the way that we manage global infrastructure, global supply chains, and ultimately trying to develop these much more resilient supply chains for the European Union and also for its partners. So I would also say that as the EU develops its economic relations with partners, increasingly it will have a security dimension, which relates to technology too. And by the way, that's not a one-way street. If you look at what the EU is planning or pledging to do around the world, through its infrastructure projects and trade projects, it also wants to make sure that it can invest in manufacturing capacity in third countries. So the idea is that as part of development in other countries, you help build manufacturing supply, the diversity of supply, etc. As we've seen in other areas, it's not a good idea to be reliant on one or two countries in case, political turbulence hits and you're left without those resilient supply chains that the EU needs. So we've discussed some of the risks. We've also discussed some of the steps that are being taken by the European Union to safeguard critical technologies. But I guess one of the remaining questions that we have to also tackle is whether or not we think over the long term, the EU's initiatives will actually bear fruit or be beneficial for the European Union. And in many respects, I would say Europe is at least theoretically on the right track in understanding that critical technologies are really an important factor when it comes to power in general. And if the EU, as it often claims, is going to be some kind of global power, then it will need those critical technologies as a basis for that. So that's one thing. In terms of the success or the long-term success of these critical technologies, well, one of the key ingredients here is not just legislation, It is not just the developments of standards, which are very important, I would say. It is not just about managing supply chain security, as important as all of those things are. But at the heart of the problem, we also have an investment issue, which is that even though the EU is investing in these technologies, when you compare how the EU invests in these areas, let's say compared to the US or even compared to China, it is still rather marginal, I would say. So the real proof of the EU's commitment to safeguarding critical technologies in the future will be whether or not it can still pump the investment needed into these sectors. Also keep in mind, by the way, that critical technologies and the development of critical technologies is not a perfect science. There is a lot of failure on the way. And now that failure can be seen as a rationale or an excuse not to do anything else in this area. But actually, when you think about research and development, research and technology as a fundamental basis for the development of technologies, there will be a whole lot of failure on the way. But that failure, as we've seen in numerous studies and also from experience, there's never really truly failure when it comes to technology development and research. So we need to maintain that industries, researchers, scientists, engineers have the financial seedbed they need to be able to make mistakes, to be able to fund failures, and then also to develop ultimately the technologies that Europe needs in an innovative way. So investment is core to all of this. But then also I think we have to try and think a little bit about how the EU is open or to what extent the EU is, let's say, ready to seize upon new technologies which are coming to the market. And here, when we take, for example, the question of the defense sector, if we also then look at some, I would say, sensitive technology domains like quantum computing and also artificial intelligence, the discussion there is very rarely just about investments. It is also about how you use those technologies. And in particular, when it comes to artificial intelligence, there is always a very sensitive discussion about the ethics of the use of these technologies. Now, I can very much understand why some are concerned about the use of artificial intelligence in areas like the defense sector. There are some very real ethical concerns there. But let's also keep in mind that we already integrate artificial intelligence in defense technologies. So even today, when it comes to surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence, targeting, we have humans who are using artificial intelligence to enhance their performance, especially in some very, very difficult situations. So we already use artificial intelligence in defense. What we now need to have, I would think as Europeans, a bit of a discussion about is how far we want that technology to influence decision-making, and also whether or not there is an appetite, but I suspect there isn't one in Europe, as to how far AI should play a bigger role in terms of military decision-making or political decision-making. If you look at other places around the world, China, for example, also the US, they have a very different approach to how to integrate AI into key sectors like defense. In Europe, we will probably take our own path that will be somehow a mixture of our ethical standards and norms compared to also the necessity of using these technologies for critical purposes such as defense. So I guess overall there will be some kind of a balance, but the question here, and I think a lot of industrial actors are actually asking this question right now, is what is the right balance between regulation and use? There is the impression today that maybe in Europe we have over-regulated the development of quantum computing in one case and also artificial intelligence. So there's always a balance that needs to be struck when new technologies are coming to market about, yes, regulating very sensitive technologies, but making sure that you don't then starve off innovation. Because if scientists, engineers, whoever it may be, don't have the incentive to experiment with certain technologies, then, of course, it raises questions about whether or not we should invest in the first place in such technology areas. And secondly, these are technologies which are people have described as disruptive technologies. So they have the potential to reshape how economies are functioning and also have a big impact on defense as well. The question for Europeans is, well, is the world going to change anyway with these technologies? I mean, what at West? how are the US going to use these technologies? How are the Chinese going to use these technologies? If we don't jump on at a relatively quick period or quick time when it comes to these technologies, we could find that we're left behind when it comes to other actors. And for industry, technology, and in this case, particularly defense, there is the risk that we miss the bus, so to speak, when it comes to these areas. So yes, ethical basis, but also how do you balance that with the need for innovation? That is a really tricky and key element in this discussion. But whether or not the EU has the ability to push through, I think so. Investment is needed. One final point on this, I guess, is investment as a means to an end. So yes, developing technologies, not starving off innovation, which we've mentioned, but also keeping in mind that you can't develop technologies unless you have people, right? And you need those skills in place. One of the things that the US is quickly discovering when they try to develop certain technologies are labor shortages. Europe is the same. So we also have this real key need to attract people, young graduates in particular, to really key critical technology areas. That means then that you have the human capital needed to develop these technologies and use those investments a bit more effectively than is the case today. So finally, it's also probably worth reflecting on where we go from here, right? So we've outlined some of the challenges, we've outlined what the EU is doing, and also some of the challenges inherent to the EU's own strategy on safeguarding critical technologies. But I guess there are also a number of future scenarios which we should try and think about, or possible futures that may be part of the development of critical technologies a bit more globally. I think one of the things that we can say for certain is that the logic of technology and security and defense as being a much more coherent area of policy for all countries, especially aspiring powers, that is here to stay as an underlying logic. So on that basis, you then have to start to think about, well, how might the US act in the future? What about the European Union? And also maybe some of the adversaries and rivals like China and Russia. I think in the case of adversaries and rivals in particular, there's a big question mark over Russia right now because of the war and also because of the economic sanctions on the Russian economy. So I guess in that respect, we also have already some evidence that shows that there are some real shortages of technology supplies in Russia. That leads us to a question about whether or not the Russian and Chinese rapprochement or partnership or alliance or friendship, however you want to call it, what that will mean also in technology terms in the future. Because I think for the Chinese, they're already a resource-rich country. They hold most of the stocks of rare earth materials in the world, but Russia is also resource-rich. So if the Chinese get some access or more access to the Russian resource base, what impact could that have on global power and global relations? I guess that is probably one of the more worrying scenarios for the West, if I can say this. And also in that context as well, let's not be naive to think that even though Europeans and the Americans are thinking about friendshoring or developing relations with third countries, the Chinese are very aware of this. So also, I would say global relations in places like Latin America, Africa, and Asia more broadly will also be caught up in this kind of race for raw materials and also the need to develop supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the big areas, I think, where people have questions and are thinking about that. Now, for the West, more generally defined, I would say, well, Europeans themselves have two options, I think, for the future. Very clearly, we can do what is always an inherent risk in European policy, which is to take largely national approaches, right? So even though we have the EU as an organizing organization, even though at the European Union level we discuss the importance of critical technologies, nevertheless, there is always the risk of national jealousies, of national competitiveness, and that leads in some respects not only to the problem of duplication of efforts, but also rivalry within Europe, which is hardly a good recipe, I would say, when you consider that we're talking about a world of giants and not, smaller states. So here the risk of fragmentation is a real risk. It is also, I would say, one of the issues so far that has held up well in the context of the single market. But we have to also see as the time moves by, whether or not there is a kind of falling back into the trap of nationalism when it comes to critical technologies. On the other hand, as well, we have to keep in mind the future scenario of transatlantic relations as well. And I think, of course, if you look at some of recent steps by the US government, in particular, the very famous, let's say, impact from the Inflation Reduction Act, there you see that the US is taking national policy that has a indirect and direct impact on European economic interests. Now, we have ways of addressing that. We have the Trade and Technology Council as one area that can be used diplomatically to address some of these issues. And also, let's state and underline the fact that whenever the leaders of the US and the European Union meet, the issue of technology, the issue of the protection of critical technologies and supplies is always on the agenda of those discussions. So diplomatically talking through those issues are really important. Right now, we seem to have a government in the US that is a bit susceptible to some of the concerns that the Europeans have. But looking to the future, we also have to then think about, well, might that change? A change of government in the US, certain changes of government in Europe may have a detrimental effect on the ability of Europe and the United States to manage coherently technology investments and supply chain security. And for that to work, especially considering what I've said about the Russian and China relationship, you would hope that the response to that is much more coherence between Europe and the United States. But there is also, of course, the risk of fragmentation in that relationship too. You could flip that argument and say that any, incoming US president in the future, any incoming governments in Europe may want to think a bit more strategically across the US and the European Union about what more they can do together to protect technologies and critical technologies. Now, that may seem like a naive thing to say because there are, of course, always industrial interests at the heart of these discussions. That's true. But there are also some, I would say, painful discussions to be had about the impact of regulation as well in both countries and about standards. So we are yet to see, but live in hope that it might be the case, we are yet to see a more coherent approach by both the US and the EU. You will notice, for example, that in the context of the Trade and Technology Council, it is largely about, I would say, redressing current policies that have been put in place. What we really need is for the TTC in the future and other bodies of this kind, and diplomatically, to get ahead of the game, so to speak. So already not to get into crisis management in the transatlantic relationship, but to set a much more positive agenda for that transatlantic relationship. We will have to see if that's possible because of politics on both sides of the Atlantic. But one would think that if the West is very serious about maintaining its technology edge and maintaining security of supply, that is the direction that both of these important global players would need to head.